overlap there. And we saw that with the synchondroses. The amphiarthroses, slightly movable, most are cartilaginous. That's where we are. Very top of page 26. So the first one is pretty cut and dry, except they're not cartilaginous. They're fibrous. Just reading straight off of your notes, guys. The syndesmoses. They're fibrous, but they're slightly movable. So they're in this category because the amphiarthritic joints are slightly movable. They're not in this category because they're fibrous. We'd rather put them in category 1, but we can't because they're not cartilaginous. They're not fibrous. We'd rather put them in category 1, but we can't because they're not immovable. So remember those 3 words. Go back to page 25. Synarthritic joints, amphiarthritic joints, diarthritic joints. Do those 3 words refer to the structure or to the function? Right there on your notes. They refer to the function. Synarthritic, immovable. Amphiarthritic, slightly movable. Diarthritic, freely movable. So your author has classified them that way, whether it makes sense to us or not. Remember the one that was equally crazy on Monday, the synchondroses. They're cartilage, but they're immovable. But we agreed that no, they're not necessarily immovable because the costovertebral joints are synchondroses. How do you breathe without moving those joints? So embrace this madness. Welcome to it. Right, so back to page 26, the syndesmoses, slightly movable but fibrous. The examples here are the distal ends of the ulna and radius and the distal ends of the tibia and fibula. So when you rotate your arms or your legs like this, you have movement between the ulna and radius, or if this is my leg, we'd be having movement between the tibia and the fibula. So that's the slight movement. The joint is fibrous. If you were going to name this joint, what would you call it? The distal blank. Radio-ulnar joint. The distal radio-ulnar joint. So fibrous, but slight movement upon rotation. What would you call the same joint at the distal ends of the tibia and the fibula? Exactly, distal tibiofibular joint. So when you rotate your leg like that, you have slight movement down here between the tibia and the fibula. It's fibrous, but slight movement is allowed upon rotation. The next one in your notes, symphyses. Symphyses are cartilaginous, but unlike synchondroses, which were hyaline cartilage, symphyses are fibrocartilage. They do allow slight movement, so they go in this category nicely. Fibrocartilage, slight movement. Your intervertebral disc fall into this category. Histology, intervertebral disc, fibrocartilage. So the joints between the vertebrae. Now you have to be very careful, and we'll just leave this on the board until we get to the second aspect of it. If you say intervertebral joints, it might be appropriate to ask which ones. Right now, we're talking about the intervertebral disc. which are fibrocartilage, and therefore syndesmoses. But what if we were looking at these other, or can you think of some other intervertebral joints? If you stack two vertebrae on top of each other, what part of the overlying vertebra articulates with the underlying vertebra? How many processes do the vertebrae have typically? 7? Okay. What part of the one on top, parts, plural, articulates with what parts of the one on the bottom?
Superior articulating.
Exactly. The inferior articulating processes of the one on top are sticking down and articulate with the superior articulating processes of the one underneath. Is that what we're talking about here? No, we're talking about the intervertebral disc. So when we say intervertebral joints, what are we talking about? We're talking about the joint here where the disc is, that's a fibrocartilage pad, that's a syndesmosis. Or are we talking about the joints right there? It's going to be a whole other classification. So again, if you simply say intervertebral joints, you've got to know which ones you're talking about. Right, can anyone think of another example of a syndesmosis, a fibrocartilage joint? Bones held together by fibrocartilage where there's a little movement. Good answer, but no. In that case, they're not considered joints. Think about pregnancy. Now what joint am I talking about? The symphysis pubis. Yeah, the symphysis pubis in the pelvis. So the symphysis pubis is a symphysis. Hence the name. The symphysis between the two pubic bones. When a woman is in labor, she is supposed to produce a hormone. It's called relaxin, that is supposed to make the symphysis pubis even more flexible than it ordinarily is. It's always a little flexible in men and women. Obviously, it becomes more flexible during childbirth, and that is supposed to be enhanced by the production of a hormone called relaxin, which is to relax the symphysis pubis. All right, so we get past the first two. This is what we looked at on Monday. We want 1 to go with 1 and 2 to go with 2. And they do, except for when they don't. But we get past those two, and it becomes easier because all of the diarthritic joints are synovial, or all of the synovial joints are diarthritic. We don't have any weirdness down here. So diarthritic means freely movable. Synovial is the structure. So this is Roman numeral 3 on page 26. We're going to take a look at the some of the typical structures in a diarthritic joint. Not every diarthritic joint contains every structure listed. Look at your notes. I've listed the structures as items 1 through 9. Not every diarthritic joint contains every one of those structures, but most contain most of those structures. So in no particular order, diarthritic joints will have hyaline cartilage on the articular surfaces of the bone. Remember, that's all diarthritic joints. It's not just in histology when we say hyaline cartilage is located on the ends of long bones to provide a smooth surface for articulation. Even the tiny, tiny, tiny diarthritic joints have articular cartilage on the articular surfaces. This goes back to facets, for example. If we look again at the this particular intervertebral joint, there is articular cartilage on those articular surfaces. Sometimes people experience lower back pain. In fact, more than 50% of the population will experience lower back pain at some point in their adult life. Very often what's happening is back here in the lumbar region, you're grinding these articular surfaces together. You have poor posture, not because of the way you sat as a child, in spite of what your mother yelled, but you have poor posture and you're in a state of lordosis. If you're in lordosis, you're grinding those facets together. As a nation, we spend billions and billions of dollars every year trying to treat this. It always, that's too big of a word, it almost always resolves itself whether medical treatment is sought or not. It's a crazy, crazy thing. Absolutely crazy. But I'll tell you something that might save you a lot of grief. If you ever experience lower back pain, of course, go to the doctor, go to the physical therapist, do whatever you want to do. But if you ever experience lower back pain, or if you have lower back pain now, you can fix it yourself with a very simple exercise called pelvic tilts. Pelvic tilts will shorten the rectus abdominis muscles. Now, sit-ups will shorten the superior rectus abdominis muscles. That won't fix the pain. You need to shorten the inferior rectus abdominis muscles. Pelvic tilts will do that. You can Google how to do pelvic tilts. You will literally shorten the inferior rectus abdominis muscles. Do them on the floor, watching television or whatever, listening to music. Pull yourself out of that lordotic state, and you'll feel better within a week of doing them each night. True. Very, very true. All right, so again, in no particular order, we'll have a look at some of these structures, not necessarily all of them. But so we have articular cartilage on the articular surfaces. Diarthritic joints contain a joint capsule. The boundary of the capsule is a membrane called the synovial membrane. That synovial membrane is filled with fluid called synovial fluid. So we've basically got three things with the same name. We have a synovial cavity lined with a synovial membrane filled with synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is probably the slipperiest stuff in the world. If we put WD-40 or silicone lubricant, we put those types of things out of business. Think about movement and reducing friction. So you have these very, very smooth articular surfaces. That's in contrast to going out in the yard and picking up two granite rocks and rubbing them together. Okay? So you have the opposite of that, hyaline cartilage on the articular surfaces, but then you fill the space with silicone lubricant or WD-40. So trying to create a near frictionless surface between the ends of the bones. Right, this is another picture from your textbook showing us some more of the structures found in synovial or diarthritic joints. You'll typically find adipose connective tissue, which is a padding. And then you'll find little sacs filled with fluid called bursa. The bursa are usually between a tendon or a ligament and the bone. They're to protect the tendon or the ligament so that it's not abraded over time by the bone. To better understand bursa, let's go on a field trip. We're not going to go rock climbing, we're going to go sport rappelling. That's a tree. The edge of a cliff. So I'll tie a rope to the tree, drop it over the edge, and we'll rappel down the rope. That's kind of a sharp edge on that cliff. I suppose that as in 1989 when we did this, devastation might be repeated in that the rope broke for the sixth student and they plummeted. So after that, what I started doing was taking one of the floor mats out of my car and laying it over the edge of the cliff to protect the rope. That's a bursa. It's that simple. So where we have a tendon or a ligament, we often have a little sac of fluid there to pad, to protect, so that over the course of time, over the course of the decades, the tendon or the ligament is not damaged. Now I could imagine that if I truly did that with my floor mat, as I have done thousands of times probably, not to sport rappel, but to rappel into caves. And if you don't know, you might be interested to know that the southeastern United States is to caving what the Rocky Mountain region is to snowboarding and snow skiing. If you look at a map, you see where Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia come together. It's called tag country. And there are more caves in that part of the United States than the entire rest of the United States put together. I've actually rappelled into the 3 deepest caves in the United States, often using a floor mat to protect my rope. Nevertheless, you could imagine that the rope might slip off the floor mat. And so sometimes what is actually done, this is also another use for duct tape, there's the rope, there's the floor mat, the black material is the duct tape. So now the rope can slip and slide a little bit to the right and left. It's not going anywhere. I don't have a picture of this, but you're going to look at it when you get home in your book. It's called a tendon sheath. You'll find them in the shoulder. Tendon sheath. In your notes, this is item 9 at the bottom of page 26. We don't have one in the knee, so I don't have a picture of it. But be sure and look at one when you get to the house or the lab, wherever your textbook is. By the way, speaking of lab and books, we have found 4 lab manuals in the lab in the last 36 hours. So if anyone's missing their lab manual, we may have it. 1 or 2 of them were taken to my office. 1 or 2 of them were left in the lab. So if you're missing a lab manual, ask me, and one of them may be yours. All right, next page. Letter B, titled Types of Synovial Joints. Joints are classified, that is, synovial joints are classified by the planes in space that they move through. Planes in space. to get a handle on planes in space, let's go back to an elementary algebra class where we graph something. We have an x-axis, we have a y-axis. This represents two planes in space. In reality, though, we have a third dimension, right? We're not going to get into physics. There may be multiple dimensions. But we certainly know we have a third dimension, and possibly easily a fourth, known as time, but we won't get into that either. If you are buying something to lay in the floor, then you need 10 times 10 equals 100 square feet in this case. But if you were going to measure this space, you would have to include the third dimension. And so instead of having square feet, what would you have? Cubic feet. So if you buy a refrigerator, you might see measurements in cubic feet, because there's a height, a width, and a depth. It's very difficult, unless you're really an artist, to draw three-dimensionally. You all know I can't. Well, that's my attempt at it. In an algebra class, the third dimension is represented by another axis called z. So we classify joints according to whether they move through 1, 2, or 3 planes in space. And that's what you're looking at on whatever this page is that we're on, 27. So our first group are the joints that don't really move through any plane in space. And so as you see, they're called non-axial. They just glide. And there's a bunch of them. Lots and lots and lots of non-axial synovial joints. So the acromioclavicular are non-axial joints. Okay, they're very complex, very sophisticated synovial joints or diathritic joints. Articular cartilage on the articular surfaces, synovial membrane, synovial fluid, joint cavity. They're very complicated joints. But they don't do this kind of stuff, okay? What is the opposite of this? In other words, this is lateral, the lateral aspect of the clavicle. What's the medial aspect of the clavicle? What joint is that? Sternoclavicular. As I said, there are lots of these. The proximal tibiofibular is another one of these. Not to be confused with the distal tibiofibular, which is a syndesmosis. What would you call the joints between the bones of the wrist?
Carpal, metacarpal.
No, between the bones of the wrist. What are the bones of the wrist? Carpals? What prefix means in between? Inter. So what would you call the joints between the bones of the wrist? Intercarpal. What would you call the joints between the bones of the ankle? Intertarsal. The TMJ has gliding activity. The TMJ is perhaps the most complex joint in the body. It will go into more than one category. What would you call the joints where the ribs articulate with the vertebrae? Let's start with, we know it's going to have vertebral in it. But what's the prefix for rib? Anybody? Costal? So what would you call the joints between the ribs and the vertebrae?
Vertebral costal.
Costovertebral. Costovertebral joints. And then let's get back to these. Intervertebral joints. Which ones? We've talked about the symphyses, which are the fibrocartilage pads. Well, now we're talking about the other ones. So these are the intervertebral joints, which consist of the articulation between the superior and inferior articular processes. These. So this is a symphysis. This is a gliding synovial joint. Okay, let's see if I've got anything else I want to add to this. One more to put on this list. The tarso-metatarsal joints. Break that word down. That would be the joints between the ankle and the bones of the, is it foot or toes? Foot. Between the ankle and the bones of the foot. All right, so all very complex joints with articular cartilage, synovial membrane, synovial fluid, ligaments holding everything together. But very simple in terms of the degree of movement they allow. They don't allow a lot of movement. They just allow a little gliding. So they're in this group called non-axial. Next category. Item 2, uniaxial. We have hinge, we have pivot. Leaving space here intentionally. Elementary school, geometry. You all learn to use a protractor and measure angles. What's the angle there?
180.
What's the angle of a straight line?
180. That's about 45.
Huh?
That's about 45.
About 45, yeah. That was my intent. When you decrease an angle, it is called flexion. So the child says to the parent, "Flex your muscles." And the parent goes, "Ooh!" That is flexion. This is a straight line. That is flexion at the elbow. So what would the opposite be?
Extension.
Extension. So I can flex, I can extend things like my elbow and my knee. In fact, at this moment, my entire body is extended. Now I'm flexing my neck while flexing my elbows, while flexing my knee, while falling over. Some joints that behave this way can go beyond extended. So I suppose there I've got 180 degrees plus about 45. So I've got 225 degrees here. So when I go beyond extended, it's called hyperextension. Now I cannot hyperextend my elbow or my knee. You can do it for me, but we won't be friends afterwards. But I can hyperextend my neck. It's extended, flex, extended, hyperextended. I can hyperextend my waist or my entire vertebral column. Flexion, extended, hyperextended. Now, when I talk about my waist, my vertebral column, is that a joint? No, it's plural, very plural. The hip and the shoulder are interesting to consider with flexion and extension. So get this down, and your book has great pictures. And this is another place where I go home and stand in front of the mirror, either alone or with a friend, and I do these things. But so my shoulders are extended. This is flexion of the shoulders. This is extension of the shoulders. They are extended. This is hyperextension of the shoulders. So how would you write that down? If you move the arms blank, you're flexing the shoulders. Huh?
Upward,
That's not upward.
outward,
Forward? You move the arms forward versus backwards? If you want to say anterior and posterior, that's fine. Now here's that problem with outward. Outward would be something different. That's still angular, but it's not on the board. All right, so with the arm and the leg, if I move it forward, that's flexion of the shoulder, flexion of the hip. When I'm in what we might call normal position, my shoulder and my hip are extended. When I go backwards, whoa, that's scary. Do this and close your eyes. That's hyperextension. So I can flex and extend my knee, my elbow, my vertebral column, my waist, my neck, my shoulder, my hip. Some of those can be hyperextended as well. So now in terms of the planes in space, make sense out of that. This it's like the x-axis, that's one dimension. We can go left or right. The y-axis, that's one dimension. We can go up or down. So this is not movement through two planes in space. This is movement through one plane in space. Okay, this is one plane in space. This would be another plane in space, but I'm not doing that right now. Can you find some other joints on your body? There's 15 or 20 of them. Now, do we want to include these? Look at yourself. Think about the names of your bones. So these would be metacarpophalangeal. These would be interphalangeal. Which of those, metacarpophalangeal, interphalangeal, or both, do we want to put in this hinge category? Just the interphalangeal. And why don't we want to put the metacarpophalangeal? Okay, your fingers can rotate. You can also do this with your fingers. So see, that's a second plane in space. So we want the interphalangeal. All of them. Okay, so you've got, look at your fingers. You've got two interphalangeal joints, but your thumb just has one. We've been through all this. This goes back to almost the first week of class. Proximal, distal, interphalangeal joint with proximal, middle, distal phalanges. You've got these in your hands. You've got these in your feet. That's why I said there's 15 or 20 of these. Right, the other category, or rather subcategory in uniaxial is pivot. A pivot joint rotates. Now, hang on. Let's not confuse. Okay, this is not rotation. This is rotation. This is circumduction. So don't confuse rotation with circumduction. So you're looking for joints right now that rotate but don't circumduct. Okay, the wheels on your car rotate. If the wheels on your car do this, you need, I don't know what, maybe ball joints, you need something. So joints that are pivot joints and rotate would include this one. What's this? The atlantoaxial. And what joint do you have right here? No, elbow's not the answer. I'm looking for a bone that has a head that rotates in a notch when you do this. Ulnar. Ulnar femur?
I don't know how to say it.
The head of the radius articulates with what? I know the lateral condyle, the capitate, but doesn't the head of the radius articulate with the ulna? What part of the ulna? Oh my God. Okay, so proximal radial ulnar joint, because the distal is a syndesmosis. So we're talking about the head of the radius with the radial notch of the ulna. Question? All right, item 3, the biaxial joints. We have two subcategories, condyloid and saddle. For condyloid, we'll start with atlanto-occipital, which is another very complex joint. We know that it allows this movement. We've already called it the yes joint. But it also, and I can't really do it to demonstrate, but you also use the atlanto-occipital joint to sort of move your head forward and backwards. And I'm not talking about by virtue of moving my entire cervical part of my vertebral column, just sort of moving your head forward and backwards, letting those occipital condyles slide back and forth across the superior articular surfaces of the atlas. Other condyloid joints are the metacarpo phalangeal joints. Okay, because unlike the interphalangeal, they not only work like a hinge, but they also work like this. You can do the same thing with your toes. And then as you see on your notes, there's one more subcategory under biaxial. It's saddle. You have two saddle joints in your body. And they constitute what we call the thumb. So if that's the first metacarpo phalangeal, well, it's actually in combination with if that's the first, then what would we need to add over here? We've already got one over there. I knew what you meant. And what about this? Is this just 2 through 5? I can't do with my big toe what I can do with my thumb. I wish I could. All right, finally, item 4, the polyaxial. Now you'll see these called not only poly, but you'll see them called tri, and you could use those words interchangeably. To call them triaxial is just consistent with the 3 planes in space. But to call them poly is obviously just means movement through any plane. You've got 2 of these. They're named with common names, generally, as I pointed out a couple of weeks ago. The glenohumeral, what's the common name for that? The shoulder. And what's the other one? The hip. So these are your ball and socket joints. All right, page 28. So now we define specifically the types of movement at diarthritic joints. We've defined 3, flexion, extension, and hyperextension. So just as when we started with the type of joints before we got into uniaxial, biaxial, triaxial, we had non-axial, which was gliding. Well, you see that same word at the top of this page. So the first type of movement is gliding, and you have numerous examples of diarthritic joints that allow simple gliding. Letter B, angular, you have flexion and extension. What do you need to add to that? We just looked at it. Hyperextension. And then moving along with angular movement, chances are, if you do that, you will kill yourself. But when you move something away from the body like that, it is called abduction. When you bring it back down, it is adduction. The TAs will say, think about adding it back to the body. Yeah, I won't be demonstrating that.
Anybody else do this split?
It does remind me, though, of an interesting yet very traumatic experience that some of you have probably experienced as well at the gym. Any gym that has weight machines, okay, not free weights, but the machines, where so many of the gyms around the perimeter of the room will have, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 different weight machines, and maybe they're not around the perimeter, maybe they're in rows, but they have something for the biceps, something for the pecs. And they have this one machine, I don't know the name of it, but you sit in it, and
this one.
it's to work the abductors, which would be the tensor fascia latae, as well as the adductors. And there's a lever over here. And you get yourself in, you guys with me? Man, I was sitting in that thing and I pull the crank. Oh, God. Dangerous piece of machinery. Anyway, so we've got the arms and the legs. This, again, flexion, extension, hyperextension. This would be abduction, adduction. But that's why the metacarpophalangeal joints aren't uniaxial. They not only flex and extend like a hinge, they also ab and adduct. Right, letter C, your circular world. So the rotation versus circumduction. We've got a couple of examples of rotating joints. The joints that allow circumduction are more complex because you're rotating around an axis. Your thumb allows circumduction. In theory, your fingers allow circumduction. It's just not as easy to circumduct your finger as it is your shoulder or your hip. You can circumduct your neck, but that's not a joint. That's the entire cervical vertebral region. Same with your waist. You can circumduct your waist. And then finally, supination and pronation. We use supination and pronation several ways. I would obtain the prone cadaver to study the posterior musculature. What did I just say? I would obtain the cadaver on its front to study the muscles of the back. So if you sleep on your stomach, you sleep in the prone position. If you sleep on your back, you sleep in the supine position. When we walk, we supinate and pronate to absorb shock. Every step you take, let's let this be a foot. And you're looking at the front of my right foot. When you take a step, you land on the medial part of your heel. And you roll not just forward, but also laterally. So you roll from the medial side of the heel to the lateral side of the forefoot. Now, let me write this down so I don't. You land on lateral heel and roll to medial forefoot. To absorb shock. Okay, this is my right foot. You're looking at the front of it. Land on the lateral heel. Roll to the medial forefoot. That medial forefoot is what lay people would call the ball of the foot. So now applying the terms here, you land supinated and roll to a pronated position. So once again, if this is my foot, if I'm on the lateral part of my foot, I'm supinated. I don't know if you can see my feet, but I'm supinated now. If I'm on the medial part of my foot, I'm pronated. Now clearly we don't land like this and roll like that. We land on the lateral heel, roll to the medial forefoot to absorb shock. There's probably less than 10% of the people on the planet that do it correctly. I think we're still learning how to walk, or we've forgotten how to walk since we invented shoes. And no, I'm not advocating barefoot running. I know all about that. I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. We're not talking about that. Most people roll too far. That is, they overpronate. So when they go from that lateral heel to medial forefoot, they roll too far. Most people, probably more than 90% of the human beings on the planet Earth, don't walk correctly. It doesn't matter, it doesn't hurt you unless you get into a repetitive motion situation. That is running or extreme long distance hiking. Now you need to straighten out your gait. You're probably not going to straighten it out by learning how to do it correctly. You're going to straighten it out with the right foot gear. Now, exercise comes up a lot in this class. Biochemistry, various places, bones, muscles. If you ever in your life decide to take up a running program, please get the proper shoes. I've said before in some other context, the two big things that give running a bad name are, number one, somebody's going to take up a running habit and they pull an old pair of tennis shoes out of their closet or out of their garage, and they're shot. Number two, they run on the sidewalk, which is made of concrete. Concrete is 100 times harder than asphalt. So if you can't get to a trail to run in the road facing the oncoming traffic. They will move. It is the law. The sidewalk is for, I don't know, maybe walking the dog, pushing a stroller. I don't know what it's for, but it's not for running. Get to a trail if you can, but if you can't, run on the asphalt, not the sidewalk. But the other one, the shoe thing. Go to a running store and have your gait analyzed. I don't care where you go. I prefer Runner's Roost because they analyze it on a natural surface, a sidewalk. They analyze it on a natural surface. Colorado Running Company and Boulder Running Company analyze it on a treadmill. That's not a natural surface. That's my beef with them. But they will put most of you in a supportive shoe that controls this overpronation. If you're a severe overpronator, they'll put you in something like the Brooks Beast. That's a wicked motion control shoe. A few of you, they'll put in a neutral shoe because you're one of the gifted, 10% in the world. A few of you, they might put in, I don't even know what it's called, but there are a few people that underpronate. Very, very few people underpronate. Nobody oversupinates. Most of us overpronate. So you have support shoes, motion control shoes, neutral shoes, and some other things thrown in. Guys, once you know what shoe you wear, then buy it at Sports Authority or online. Save some money. But get that initial pair and then go back once a year and get that initial pair with somebody that's trained to analyze your gait. And I say go back once a year because just because you wore the ASICS blah blah this year doesn't mean that next year's model is going to be identical. It probably won't be identical. The ASICS Gel Cumulus does not stay exactly the same from year to year to year. In some cases, they'll recommend you buy an orthotic, just over-the-counter orthotic, a product like Superfeet to go on your shoe to control this. This is huge. This can prevent hip pain, knee pain, ankle pain, lower back pain. This is huge, huge, huge. And again, you don't have to be running. If you were going to go, try to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, or the Continental Divide Trail, or the Appalachian Trail, or any of the long trails in the United States, if that's what you were doing next summer, it would be a good idea to be figuring out what type of foot gear would, be best at preventing injury. Most people, like I said, they go out in the garage, they grab those tennis shoes they've been mowing the lawn in for the last 3 years. They're junk. Log the miles on your shoe. Keep an Excel spreadsheet. 500 miles, if you're little like me, throw them away. If you're bigger, 400 miles, throw them away. If you're bigger, 300 miles, throw them away. You don't really have to throw them away. They become lawn mowing shoes. Or shoes that I wear when I paint the fence, or whatever. That's the sort of thing that gives running a bad name. Study after study, and another one just came out in the last year. They look at old people, a lot older than me, and they look at the incidence of arthritis in the knee, and they compare runners to non-runners. Guess who has the lower incidence of arthritis? Lower incidence is found in the runners. Your body was meant to be used. Use it. What happens if you park your car in the garage and you go off to college and come home a year later? Starts rusting out, tires are flat, battery's dead. Yeah, body was meant to be used, man. Use it. So, a lot there just came up in the context of supination and pronation, okay? So make sure you have all of that. Okay, we've got a few more types of movement to mention, and then we'll call it a day. These are under category special, page 29. Inversion and eversion, those are usually, those words are used for the ankle. If you roll the forefoot medially, that's inversion. If you roll the forefoot laterally, that's eversion. You can see my feet. My feet are inverted. It's the same as being supinated. But we use supination and pronation when we're talking about the gait. So I'm landing on the lateral heel, rolling to the medial forefoot. But when I am in this position, I am inverted. That's soles medial, inverted, soles lateral, everted. As we use these words, think about your muscle chart. These are the words on the chart. Biceps brachii flexes, triceps extends, peroneus eversion, anterior posterior tibialis inversion. These are the same exact words. At this very moment, you are transitioning from bones through joints to muscles. Musculoskeletal. All right, protract and retract. We use those words with our shoulders and our jaw. So if I move my shoulders forward, that's protraction. When I bring them back, that's retraction. Protraction, retraction. I can't demonstrate it adequately with my jaw if anyone wants to come down here and do it. But if you thrust, ooh, that's downright scary. Just messing with you, I'm sorry. But it looked like you were trying to demonstrate it. Oh, you weren't? Oh, well then I'm really very sorry. Anyway, if you thrust your mandible forward, that's protraction. And some people can do it very, very pronounced. And then when you bring it back, that's retraction. I can't do it worth even trying to demonstrate. So you can go home and stand in front of the mirror. I'm half blind. I truly thought you were protracting your mandible. And it looked like it moved quite a bit. And I thought, oh, wow, that's cool. I was going to have you come stand right here. All right, the next two, elevate and depress. Now, just reading those words remind me of something I've already asked you to do. Go through the muscle chart and ask yourself what's in the name of the muscle that negates some rote memory. The levator scapula. I bet the levator scapula rotate the foot, huh? That's just dumb at this point in your study. So I can elevate the shoulders, I can depress the shoulders. What else might I be able to elevate and depress? I'm doing it right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. My TMJ. When you close your mouth, you're elevating your mandible. When you open your mouth, you're depressing your mandible. Can I grab your hand? Do you mind? So her hand's a dog snout. Can you put your hands around a dog, let's say a German Shepherd snout like that, and keep it from opening its mouth? Okay. Yeah, easily. They even do it at the alligator farms. Those guys are interesting. They're always missing some fingers, but they always want a little kid from the audience to come down and hold the snout of the alligator closed. But now, if that dog or that alligator clamps down on you, can you pry its jaws open? No way in the world. So what do you have more musculature to do? Close your mouth or open your mouth? Close it. You've got the muscles for closing. So now translation to what we're talking about here on the notes, you have more musculature for elevating the mandible or for depressing the mandible? Elevating is closing. And finally, dilate and constrict. Again, the category here is special, dilate and constrict, or I suppose the two most special types of movement. So in your face, can you think of 3 muscles that dilate and constrict? Okay, so now I want 5 because we just added the iris. What's the kissing muscle? Oh, orbicularis oris, around the eye. Orbicularis oculi. Okay. Avicularis oris, avicularis oculi. These are on page 1 of the muscle chart. I'm kind of shocked everybody didn't know their names. Because I'd wait till the night before the exam to memorize the muscle chart. My son did that. He couldn't take the class with me. That'd be a conflict of interest. But yeah, he waited till the night before the test to memorize the muscle chart.
How'd that work out for him?
He did well. he did very well. He said, "Dad, it's just 7 muscles. What's the big deal?" I said, "Dude, you're just asking for trouble." Anyway, all right. You have these sphincter muscles, and whoever said pupil? Yeah, good. Okay, the pupil is actually the hole in the iris. When you look at somebody's eye, the colored part of their eye is their iris. So blue eyes, green eyes. The pupil is the hole. And we dilate or constrict the pupil, change the size of the pupillary opening, just like the iris diaphragm in a microscope, to control how much light gets in. So you look up at the sun, your pupils constrict. You look down in the dark, your pupils dilate. This is all controlled instantaneously and subconsciously, which is why if you get pulled over at 3 o'clock in the morning, the police officer shines a light in your eyes, because your pupils should constrict instantly. If they don't, you're impaired, and bang, they got you. It's just the simplest thing in the world. If your pupils are dilated to the point that you don't even have an iris, you're on speed. Cocaine, methamphetamine. If your pupils are constricted to what is called pinpoint, you're on heroin. Simplest way in the world to look at somebody and see what's going on in terms of drug abuse. If it's 3 o'clock in the morning, police officer might be suspicious about that. It's not to say you don't have the right to be out at 3 o'clock in the morning. You absolutely do. But cops think like this. Anyway, you have these sphincter muscles all over the place. Go back to lab exercises 1 and 2, where you learn the basics of all the systems and the organs. And picture the, just pull a quick picture up here. We've got a couple of minutes left. So this is actually from the digestive system, something we'll look at next semester. I don't care about, I am not asking you to remember the names right now. My point is, these sphincter muscles are valves. Just like your anal sphincter muscle is a valve, okay? Point made, it's a valve. Got it? You have a sphincter muscle between your esophagus and your stomach. It has to open so that when you swallow, the food can move into the stomach. You have a sphincter muscle at the distal aspect of your stomach. It has to open to let the food move out of the stomach into the small intestines. After you've swallowed and food is in the stomach, the proximal and distal sphincters of the stomach will both close so that the stomach can churn and mix everything with acid and enzymes. Once the mixing is complete, the valve will open, let the stuff out, moves through the small intestine. You have a sphincter muscle that connects the small intestine to the large intestine. You have a sphincter muscle where you release the waste. You have sphincter muscles all along your blood vessels. So if it's very cold outside, I will constrict the blood vessels that feed my fingers so that I don't send any blood into my fingers. My fingers get cold. I got to start moving around, exercising, doing something, because you've got to keep that blood deep in the core of your body. So the sphincter muscles, they're not all by any means skeletal muscle, which is what we primarily think about in AMP1 when we think about muscles. We think about movement. Movement. But you have these sphincter muscles all over the place doing all types of things. You have sphincter muscles shows what I want to show, but a little, you have sphincter muscles associated with your urinary bladder and your urethra. How do you hold the urine in, and how do you let the urine out when the time is appropriate to let it out? So these are valves. Whether we're talking about the bicularis, oculi, bicularis oris, or all of these others all over the place. Okay, so we will begin on Monday on page 30. Now we will have time for some questions on Monday, plenty of time actually for some questions. So make sure you've got that exam 2 review sheet off of D2L. Work your way through it, grind your way through it. I tell students I would use the review sheets as a take-home essay exam, writing out everything I can find about every topic. So then